With Mary in prison in England, the country was being run by her half-brother James Stuart, the Earl of Murray, who was acting as regent to the infant King James VI. And Queen Elizabeth in England, she decided to launch an inquiry and arbitrate over whom she thought should be in charge in Scotland. Basically, England was making decisions on behalf of Scotland. Thank God those days are behind us, am I right, folks? And so the inquiry opened in York, it moved to Westminster, onto Hampden Court, and I kind of toured the inquiry, but the whole thing was pretty pointless because Mary, she wasn't allowed to attend the inquiry, and Murray, he knew that he could present whatever lies, bullshit, misdirection he wanted. The commissioners were never going to reinstate Mary as queen. They were always going to find in his favour. It was like the Trump impeachment trial, I suppose. And the inquiry, it started off by being about one thing, i.e. Murray's acts of rebellion against Mary, but it very quickly became about something else, and that is Mary's alleged involvement in the murder of her second husband, Lord Henry Darnley. It's like that press conference they had in the garden at Downing Street, isn't it? You know, like it started off by being about Dominic Cummings' decision to pack his COVID-infested family into a car and drive the length of the country during a global pandemic, and then very quickly became about his decision to drive to check if he was fucking blind or not. Now, a lot of the evidence that Murray was presenting at the inquiry was being prepared by George Buchanan. Now, George Buchanan had been the chief scholar in Mary's court, but was now head of the Scottish Reformation and was a man who despised her even more than John Knox did. Basically, he started off by being pretty sound and then turned out to be a complete and utter prick. Very much the Nick Clegg of his time, if you will. And one of the pieces of evidence that they presented was a tract that Buchanan wrote that laid out all of the apparent lurid and outrageous sexual acts and exploits that Mary was apparently into, which, I mean, even at the trial of Tommy Sheridan would have sounded a bit far-fetched, you know? Now, in the end, Elizabeth, she ruled not proven on all accounts. And this is very much in keeping with Queen Elizabeth because she didn't like making decisions. She would just kind of wait and see how things panned out. I mean, I doubt she would wait until 76,000 people had died of coronavirus, but still, nonetheless. And it was actually a very clever piece of politics from Elizabeth because a not proven verdict, it appeased the Queen's men, the Marians, those that supported Mary Queen of Scots, because she wasn't found guilty of anything, and so she could be returned to the throne. And it appeased the King's men, those that supported the Regency, because they were returned to power. And it was at this point that there was quite a lot of high-profile defections from the King's men to the Queen's men, most notably that of Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange, the keeper of Edinburgh Castle. Now, Kirkcaldy, he had been utterly appalled at the treatment of the Queen after Carberry Hill. Like, the Queen, she had been reduced to only 4 golden pianos and only 1 private jet for her paedophile son. Absolutely shocking stuff. And so Scotland was plunged into a civil war, and the Queen's men and the King's men, they set up rival parliaments in Edinburgh and in Leith, and each parliament, it spent a lot of time forfeiting the lands of the other parliament, it spent a lot of time executing the other parliament's prisoners without mercy. One parliament claimed that the other parliament had died a couple of years earlier, and so all of their land and titles were void anyway. That parliament claimed that that parliament was obsessed with that parliament. What both parliaments didn't realise was that the rest of Scotland, who didn't support either parliament, fucking hated both parliaments. And Edinburgh very much became a divided city. It became Glasgow, if you will. Now, the Civil War in Scotland, it came to an end on the 28th of May, 1573, when the King's men, after years and years of constant bombardment of Edinburgh Castle, with support from Queen Elizabeth in England, eventually managed to take Edinburgh Castle and force the surrender of Sir William Kirkcaldy, marking the end of any real support that Mary had left in Scotland. Mary was now a forgotten queen, and this was highlighted by the fact that when James VI made a peace treaty with England in 1586, Mary's name wasn't even mentioned. Mary was now considered a nuisance on both sides of the border, the original scabby queen, as it were. And during her time in imprisonment in England, the English parliamentarians, they desperately were trying to prove that Mary was involved in plots to have Elizabeth killed, because this would lead to her execution, which is ultimately what they wanted. They were so desperate, they would do things like follow the Scottish leader to funerals, right? And then hang out in the bushes and take photos of her from a distance, not wearing a mask, but speaking to someone outdoors, socially distanced, because they generally thought this would be the thing that would topple her, you know? And most of the plots that Mary was alleged to have been involved in, they were all pretty half-baked and pretty nonsensical. They would involve northern Catholic rebellions and invasions from Spain. It was pretty it was pretty far-fetched stuff, do you know what I mean? Like, everyone knows that it's England that invades Spain every summer and not the other way around. But eventually, Mary was caught up in one of these plots, and her execution warrant, it was put in the middle of a pile of papers that was then handed to Queen Elizabeth, which she signed pretending not to notice, in the same way that our Queen pretends not to notice that her son is a nonce, you know? And so Mary, she was executed on the 8th of February 1587 at Fotheringhay Castle. And as she was taken into her execution hall, she actually snuck in her favourite wee Skye Terrier dog, which is what the rest of us will have to do now if we want to take our pets to Europe as well. The executioner, it took him a couple of swings of the axe before he severed Mary's head. And he picked up her severed head and shouted, "God save Queen Elizabeth," like a Northern Irish paramilitary. And there was shock as Mary's head then fell to the floor. And it turned out that Mary had been wearing an auburn wig and that she had gone grey. I love how that is the most shocking thing in the execution. Do you know what I mean? Like watching an ISIS beheading video and going, "Oh, turns out that she wasn't a natural blonde all along, cheeky bitch." Do you know what I mean? That's the most shocking thing about it, you know. All of the blood was very, very quickly mopped up. All of Mary's clothes were then burnt. Anything that she touched was destroyed because the English, they didn't want Mary to be made into a martyr. They didn't want any holy relics. And so the English, they had beheaded the Scottish Queen. And I think it's only fair that we get to behead one of their queens now. Do you know what I mean? I think we should get to behead the English Queen. A head for a head, after all. And so Mary's death, it was about as tragic as her life had been. And that pretty much brings to a conclusion the Mary Queen of Scots story. And I'll tell you all about the reign of her son, James VI, next time. Thank you so much for listening.